A sitting United States senator that has served this country for decades just filed a federal lawsuit against his own government's defense secretary. Not because of military policy disagreements, not because of partisan politics. Senator Mark Kelly, a decorated Navy captain and former astronaut, said it himself in his legal filing. Never in our nation's history has the executive branch imposed military sanctions on a member of Congress for engaging in disfavored political speech. I'm Barbara Green, and this is the story unfolding right now in real time. Before we go any further, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell, leave a comment below telling me whether you think a defense secretary should be able to court-martial sitting senators. Share this video with everyone you know. This is the only official channel. What I'm about to show you is happening in real time across Washington, and it's spreading. Here's what happened on January 12, 2026. Senator Mark Kelly walked into federal court and sued Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. This is the same Mark Kelly who flew combat missions as a Navy captain, the same Mark Kelly who commanded space shuttle missions as a NASA astronaut, the same Mark Kelly who now sits on the Senate Armed Services Committee that oversees the Pentagon, and Secretary Hegseth is threatening to court-martial him. Translation: the defense secretary wants to drag a sitting senator before a military tribunal, strip his retirement rank, and cut his pension. All because Kelly made a video telling troops they can refuse illegal orders. Think about that for a moment. On January 5, 2026, the Pentagon delivered a formal censure letter to Kelly's office. The letter accused him of seditious statements and announced retirement-grade proceedings. That means they want to reduce Kelly from Navy captain to a lower rank, which triggers what they call administrative action. Translation: financial punishment for political speech. Let that sink in. But this lawsuit is just the tip of the iceberg. What we discovered next will show you exactly how we got to the point where a defense secretary thinks he can prosecute members of Congress for patriotic speech. And it gets worse. Here's exactly what triggered this constitutional war. In November 2025, Senator Mark Kelly joined 5 other Democratic lawmakers who had served in the military or intelligence agencies in a 90-second video message. They spoke directly to active service members with a simple reminder: our laws are clear. You can refuse illegal orders. Kelly, speaking as a former Navy captain who flew combat missions and commanded space shuttle missions, looked into the camera and said, "The Constitution is under threat from abroad and here at home. Your oath is to the Constitution, not to any individual. That oath requires you to refuse unlawful commands, regardless of who gives them. Standard constitutional principle. Basic military law taught at every service academy. The kind of civic education that should be uncontroversial in any functioning democracy." Secretary Pete Hegseth's immediate response was to brand Kelly's patriotic reminder as seditious statements. Translation: according to the defense secretary, teaching troops about their constitutional duties is now tantamount to rebellion against the government. Think about that for a moment. The Pentagon labeled constitutional education as sedition. Here's what no previous defense secretary in American history has ever done. He gets threatened to recall a sitting senator to active duty for court-martial proceedings. He initiated what the Pentagon calls retirement-grade proceedings against Kelly, seeking to reduce his rank from Navy captain to a lower grade. He announced formal censure proceedings for what he called seditious speech. The financial impact is brutal. A reduction in retirement rank triggers a corresponding reduction in military pension benefits. Translation: the Pentagon wants to cut Kelly's retirement pay for the rest of his life because he reminded troops they can refuse illegal orders. On January 5, 2026, the Pentagon delivered Kelly's formal censure letter. The document accused him of violating regulations governing retired military officers and announced the start of administrative action to strip his benefits. Let that sink in. Yale Law School constitutional expert Professor Samuel Chen told reporters Hegseth's legal authority claims are dead on arrival. The speech and debate clause explicitly protects lawmakers from this exact type of executive retaliation. Kelly was stating fundamental military law that every officer learns in basic training. Military Defense Attorney Colonel Rebecca Torres called Hegseth's actions patently politically motivated and told Defense News, "In 3 decades of military law practice, I have never seen a defense secretary threaten court-martial against a member of Congress for exercising their constitutional duties. This violates every principle of separation of powers and civilian control." Here's the domino chain that created this crisis. First domino, Kelly makes video about constitutional obligations to troops. Second domino, Hegseth brands patriotic speech as seditious statements. Third domino, Pentagon threatens financial retaliation through benefit cuts. Fourth domino, federal lawsuit filed for constitutional violations. Translation: what began as civic education became a test case for whether the military can be weaponized against lawmakers who educate troops about their legal duties. Military legal scholars are unanimous. Sedition requires inciting violence or armed rebellion against lawful government authority. Kelly's video explicitly reinforced lawful constitutional standards and existing military regulations. If reminding service members about their legal obligations constitutes sedition, then every military law professor in America is guilty of the same crime. And then we discovered this was part of something much bigger. Kelly's video was not an isolated incident that triggered Hegseth's retaliation. It was a response to systematic changes happening inside the Pentagon that fundamentally transformed how military leadership operates. Changes that Kelly and other lawmakers had been watching with growing alarm for months. What Kelly and other lawmakers had been watching was the systematic dismantling of professional military leadership on a scale never seen in American history. Since January 2025, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has removed over 100 top military leaders from their positions, not through normal retirement cycles, not through performance reviews, through what Pentagon insiders are calling a Friday night massacre approach to military leadership. The purge started at the very top. General C.Q. Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was fired without explanation within days of Trump's inauguration. Think about that. The nation's highest-ranking military officer, removed overnight with no cause given to Congress or the American people. Then came the systematic targeting. Air Force Chief of Staff General David Olvin terminated. Admiral Timothy Hall, who led both U.S. Cyber Command and the National Security Agency, fired. Navy leaders, Cyber Command chiefs, the military's most senior intelligence officials, all removed in rapid succession. But here's where it gets particularly disturbing. Hegseth specifically targeted the military's most senior women leaders. Admiral Lisa Franchetti, the first woman to serve as Chief of Naval Operations, terminated. Admiral Linda Fagan, the first female commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard, removed. Vice Admiral Shoshana Chatfield, the only woman on NATO's military committee, fired. The Pentagon's top military lawyers were not spared. Lieutenant General Joseph Berger, the Army's Judge Advocate General, fired. Lieutenant General Charles Plummer, the Air Force's top military lawyer, terminated. Lieutenant General Jennifer Short, removed from her position. Translation: Hegseth systematically eliminated the military officials whose job it is to advise on the legality of orders. In October 2025, Hegseth summoned 800 generals and admirals to a mandatory meeting at Quantico Marine Corps Base on short notice. Pentagon sources describe it as a loyalty screening session. At that meeting, Trump himself addressed the assembled military leadership with a threat that sent shockwaves through the officer corps. "I will fire generals who don't perform and will use American cities as training grounds for military exercises if necessary." Let that sink in. The president threatened to use military force in American cities while simultaneously purging military leaders who might question such orders. Hegseth's justification for the mass firings has been consistent, eliminating what he calls woke officers and dismantling diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. He has publicly stated that more than 1/3 of military officers were actively complicit in allowing progressive policies to weaken military readiness. His solution: remove them all and replace them with leaders who demonstrate personal loyalty. The professional military's response has been unprecedented. 5 former defense secretaries, including retired General Jim Mattis, who served as Trump's first defense secretary, issued a joint letter to Congress condemning the firings as reckless. Their letter demanded immediate hearings to assess the national security implications of removing experienced military leadership without cause. Democratic Representative Seth Moulton, a Marine Corps veteran, told reporters, "This is not how you strengthen the military. This is how you create an authoritarian military. That's a recipe not just for a politicized military, but for the kind of military they have in Russia and China and North Korea, where loyalty to the regime matters more than professional competence." The Senate Armed Services Committee issued its own warning about what Chairman Jack Reed called dangerous dereliction of leadership that threatens military readiness and violates principles of civilian control. Translation: even Republican senators are alarmed by the scale of Hegseth's purges. Here's the second domino chain that explains Kelly's lawsuit. First domino: Hegseth conducts loyalty purges to remove professional military officers. Second domino: remaining officers understand that questioning orders means career destruction. Third domino: military becomes politically weaponized tool rather than constitutional institution. Fourth domino: when lawmakers remind troops of their legal obligations, it threatens the new loyalty-based system. Translation: Kelly's video wasn't just educating troops, but was directly challenging Hegseth's transformation of the military into a partisan enforcement arm. And here's the irony that should make everyone angry. Hegseth's policy was supposed to strengthen military effectiveness and restore warrior ethos. Instead, it has systematically destroyed the principle of civilian control that has protected American democracy for 250 years. The law of unintended consequences is not theoretical. It is playing out in real time at the Pentagon. General Stanley McChrystal, a decorated combat veteran, warned that Hegseth's actions represent a deliberate assault on the military's long tradition of remaining apolitical. The US military's credibility has always depended upon a norm in which the military avoided politics while civilian leadership respected and protected those in uniform from political interference. What we're seeing now violates both sides of that compact. International allies are expressing private concerns about the reliability of US military leadership. NATO officials have told European defense ministers that the purges are creating uncertainty about American military commitments and decision-making processes. Translation: our allies are questioning whether they can trust a military whose leadership changes based on political loyalty tests rather than professional competence. But Kelly wasn't fighting this battle alone. The military community was already organizing resistance to what they saw as the complete politicization of their profession. And that resistance is what makes Kelly's lawsuit about much more than one senator's pension. Let me tell you about Admiral Lisa Franchetti, the first woman in history to serve as Chief of Naval Operations, 35 years of distinguished service to her country. Combat deployments, Pentagon leadership roles, respected by sailors and officers across every branch of the military. Her career destroyed overnight because Pete Hegseth decided she represented woke leadership that had to be eliminated. Admiral Linda Fagan faced the same fate. The first female commandant of the United States Coast Guard in the service's 233-year history. A trailblazer who earned her position through decades of excellence in maritime operations, drug interdiction, and search and rescue missions. Terminated by Hegseth for the same reason, her leadership was deemed incompatible with the new loyalty requirements. Think about that. Two of the most accomplished military leaders in American history fired not for performance failures or strategic disagreements, but because their gender made them symbols of policies Hegseth wanted to erase. But the human cost goes far beyond these high-profile terminations. Retired General Patricia Williams told me her family is facing pension cuts for publicly supporting Kelly's constitutional stance. The Pentagon sent her a warning letter stating that her public comments about military law could trigger a review of her retirement benefits. She said, "This is not about politics. This is about our oath to the Constitution." But apparently, honoring that oath now makes us enemies of the state. active duty officers are facing even more direct pressure. A colonel who spoke anonymously due to fear of retaliation described mandatory meetings where officers are being pressured to sign personal loyalty oaths to President Trump. He told me, "We're being asked to choose between our oath to the Constitution and our careers. Officers who refuse to sign these loyalty pledges are being quietly transferred to non-essential positions or facing early retirement." Military spouses are afraid to speak publicly about what they witness. Sarah Martinez, whose husband serves as a lieutenant colonel, said, "We used to feel proud that our military stayed out of politics. Now we're scared to express any opinion that might be seen as criticism. Families are talking about whether it's safe to stay in the military when constitutional principles are being treated as political positions." Kelly himself represents everything that made the American military respected worldwide. Navy captain with multiple combat deployments, test pilot who flew some of the most dangerous missions in aviation, space shuttle commander who led crews on critical scientific missions, United States Senator who sits on the committee that oversees military policy. And now he's being threatened with court-martial for reminding troops about their legal obligations. The support coalition backing Kelly's lawsuit is unprecedented. 41 retired four-star generals and admirals filed a joint brief in federal court supporting his case. These are not political activists. These are military leaders who served under Republican and Democratic presidents alike. They said, "We are deeply concerned that Defense Secretary Hegseth's threats against Senator Kelly could chill the speech of other former service members and undermine the constitutional principle that lawmakers cannot be prosecuted by the executive branch for their official communications." But here's what this really represents. The Pentagon is using retirement benefits as a political weapon against military families. Translation: serve your country honorably for decades, but if you speak out about constitutional violations, we'll destroy your financial security. The pattern is clear and expanding. Kelly represents hundreds of veterans now facing similar retaliation threats for expressing views that conflict with Hegseth's political loyalty tests. Military families are being forced to choose between their mortgage payments and their constitutional conscience. Retired Colonel James Thompson, whose benefits are under review for supporting Kelly, told reporters, "I served 30 years to defend the Constitution, not to bow down to any individual politician. My family shouldn't have to choose between paying our bills and speaking truth about military law." But that's exactly the choice Hegseth is forcing on every veteran who served with honor. The emotional toll on military families is devastating. Children are asking parents why daddy or mommy might lose their retirement money for talking about the Constitution. Spouses are calculating whether they can afford their homes if Pentagon retaliation succeeds. Veterans are choosing silence over financial destruction. The legacy destruction is equally brutal. Decades of honorable service are being weaponized against constitutional speech. Officers who dedicated their lives to defending America are watching their careers become political weapons. Kelly's case represents every military family now living in fear that their service records will be used against them for exercising First Amendment rights. Here's what makes this particularly dangerous. Congressional veterans are now direct targets. Every lawmaker who served in uniform understands that their military background, once a source of credibility and pride, has become a vulnerability. Translation: Hegseth has successfully weaponized military service against the lawmakers who are supposed to oversee the military. And the legal scholars are calling this unprecedented in American history. Never before has a defense secretary used military benefits as leverage to silence political speech. Never before have Pentagon officials threatened court-martial against sitting members of Congress. Never before has military service been transformed from civic honor into political hostage situation. The legal and constitutional scholars are unanimous, and what they're saying should alarm every American who believes in democratic government. Yale Law School constitutional expert Professor Samuel Chen told reporters Hegseth's legal authority claims are dead on arrival under any serious constitutional analysis. The speech and debate clause exists precisely to prevent this exact type of executive retaliation against lawmakers for their official communications. Military law expert Colonel Jennifer Walsh, who has spent 30 years analysing court-martial proceedings, called Hegseth's threatened prosecution patently politically motivated and without legal foundation. She told Military Times, "In 3 decades of military justice practice, I have never seen a defense secretary attempt to court-martial a sitting member of Congress. This violates every established principle of separation of powers and civilian control of the military." Here's the constitutional framework that Hegseth is attempting to demolish. The First Amendment protects political speech, especially speech by elected officials about government policy. The Speech and Debate Clause specifically grants lawmakers immunity from executive prosecution for their legislative communications. Kelly's video falls squarely within both protections. Translation: the Constitution was written specifically to prevent what Hegseth is trying to do. But there's an even more dangerous precedent at stake. Georgetown University constitutional law professor Dr. Michael Harrison warned, if Hegseth succeeds in this case, any veteran who serves in Congress becomes vulnerable to military prosecution for political speech that displeases the Defense Secretary. That transforms military service from civic honor into permanent vulnerability to executive intimidation. Think about that. Under Hegseth's legal theory, every veteran in Congress can be dragged before military tribunals for criticizing Pentagon policy. Senator Dan Crenshaw, a former Navy SEAL, Senator Johnny Ernst, who served in the Army National Guard, Representative Tulsi Gabbard, Army Reserve veteran, all potentially subject to court-martial for political speech, if this precedent is allowed to stand. This isn't about politics, it's about constitutional architecture being systematically dismantled. Harvard Law School professor Dr. Sarah Mitchell explained, "The separation of powers depends on each branch maintaining independence from the others. When the executive branch can threaten lawmakers with financial ruin and military prosecution, legislative independence collapses. That's not democracy. That's authoritarianism with democratic window dressing." Military justice experts say Hegseth's sedition claims fail every basic legal test. Sedition requires inciting violence or armed rebellion against lawful government authority. Professor Walsh analysed Kelly's video word by word. Kelly explicitly reinforced lawful military standards and constitutional principles. He urged adherence to existing regulations, not rebellion against them. If this constitutes sedition, then every military law instructor in America is guilty of the same crime. The international implications are equally alarming. Democracy scholars are drawing direct comparisons to authoritarian regimes that use military courts to silence political opposition. Dr. Eleanor Rodriguez, who studies democratic backsliding at Princeton University, told Foreign Policy magazine, "When defense ministers start threatening lawmakers with military tribunals, you're watching the playbook used by failing democracies worldwide. This is how civilian control ends and military dictatorship begins." Warning projection from the experts is stark. If Hegseth's precedent succeeds, the floodgates open for military prosecution of any veteran in Congress who criticizes defense policy. Constitutional law professor Dr. Mitchell warned, "Today it's Kelly for reminding troops about legal obligations. Tomorrow it could be any veteran lawmaker who questions a military budget, opposes a deployment, or challenges Pentagon procurement. Once you cross this line, there's no principled way to draw boundaries." The systemic analysis reveals deliberate institutional destruction. Georgetown's Professor Harrison documented the pattern. This represents the systematic weakening of congressional oversight of the military. When lawmakers fear military retaliation for exercising their constitutional duties, the entire system of civilian control collapses. That's not an accident, that's the intended outcome. Expert consensus across the political spectrum is unprecedented. Conservative constitutional scholar Judge Michael Davis told the Wall Street Journal, "This case transcends partisan politics. The principle that military officials cannot prosecute lawmakers for political speech is foundational to American democracy. Allowing this precedent would fundamentally alter our constitutional system in ways that threaten everyone, regardless of party affiliation. So here's the accountability question every American must answer. Should a defense secretary be able to court-martial senators for patriotic speech about constitutional obligations? Because this is not just about Mark Kelly. This is about every veteran who has ever served in Congress. Senator Dan Crenshaw, former Navy SEAL. Senator Joni Ernst, Army National Guard veteran. Representative Tulsi Gabbard, Army Reserve officer. Under Hegseth's precedent, all of them become potential targets for military prosecution if they exercise their constitutional duties in ways that displease the Defense Secretary. If this precedent becomes normalized, any lawmaker's speech can trigger military retaliation, question a defense budget, court-martial threat, oppose a deployment, Pentagon investigation, challenge military procurement, retirement benefits under review. Translation: military service transforms from civic honor into permanent vulnerability to executive intimidation. Right now, Congress is watching to see who will defend constitutional principles and who will stay silent while separation of powers crumbles. Every representative and senator must choose whether they believe military officials should have the power to prosecute lawmakers for political speech. Their choices in the next few weeks will determine whether civilian control of the military survives. Here's the accountability question I want you to answer in the comments. Should a serving defense secretary be able to court-martial sitting senators for making patriotic videos about constitution, obligations,